Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 39th annual East Bay Leadership Series, presented by Kaiser Permanente. My name is Mark Orcutt, and I'm proud to serve as the President and CEO of the East Bay Leadership Council. For those new to the EBLC, we are an employer-led nonprofit organization on a mission to strengthen the economy and improve quality of life here in the East Bay. We advance that mission through policy advocacy, innovative programs, and events like today that create space for conversations that we hope inspire action. This series is also an important fundraiser for our organization, and I'm grateful for the support of all of our sponsors who make this series and so much of our work possible. So before we get started, let me start by thanking our presenting sponsor, Kaiser Permanente, and EBLC's Vice Chair of Events, Deneen Wolford. For her outstanding leadership, Deneen and her team at Kaiser have understood the value of creating space for important conversations in our community. We're so grateful for their continued support in making this series possible. I also want to thank our major sponsors, AssetMark, with leadership from Ted Angus, Chevron, with leadership from Andrea Bailey, Marathon, with leadership from Nicole Carranza, and the Martinez Refining Company, with leadership from Ann Notarangelo. Our sustaining sponsors, CSAA Insurance Group, a AAA insurer, Safeway, and Sutter Health, and our contributing sponsors, CEMEX, the Contra Costa Association of Realtors, Contra Costa Water District, Hanson Bridget, H-Cycle, Hacienda, IBEW Local 302, John Muir Health, PG&E, Phillips 66, Wells Fargo, the Workforce Development Board of Contra Costa County, and 3 first-time sponsors of the series, CNH Sugar, Equitify, and Comerica Bank. Thank you to all of those sponsors. And for members of the board who want to contribute as individuals, we have a special opportunity available, and we call that Community Leader Sponsorship. Their names are listed on the screen, and if you see them in the chat, please message them to thank them for their individual commitment to EBLC. They deserve the extra love. I don't know if you were keeping count, but I was, and there was 32 sponsors there. It's a long list, but one I will certainly never get tired of reading and hope to grow in the years to come. So we're proud to stand with so many partners who believe and support our mission so profoundly. So before I introduce Dan and we get into the program, one quick note, please submit any questions for today's session through the Q&A feature on Zoom, not the chat. It makes it much easier for us to queue the questions efficiently. So look for that Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen to help us do that efficiently today. Thank you for your help there. Okay, with that, I am so pleased to introduce today's featured speaker, Dan Walters. Dan's unparalleled, and I don't use that lightly, career as a political columnist has chronicled the stories, shifts, and showdowns that have defined California's politics in so many ways. Dan began his journalism career in 1960 at the Humboldt Times and has spent more than 6 decades reporting on California, including 50 years covering the state's capital. He recently just celebrated that anniversary. After joining the Sacramento Bee in 1984, his column became a must-read for anyone following state politics. Today, he continues that work at CalMatters, where he brings historical depth and a sharp analysis to policy challenges facing California. With thousands of columns to his name, he's lost track, but I hear it's somewhere in the 11,000 range, 2 books published. Dan remains one of the most trusted and influential voices on California government. So please join me in welcoming Dan Walters. He's going to kick us off with some prepared remarks, talk about his journey, and maybe anything he has on the top of mind in California politics today before we cut to questions from me and the audience. Dan, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I'm not sure about those prepared. These might be unprepared remarks, more likely. But anyway, greetings from Sacramento. I'm about 2 blocks from the Capitol, which is about as close as I like to get to it. If I have a bad influence on me if I went over there more often. I think I'd like to start out today with a little dose of reality we're about California these days in 2025. First of all, and I think maybe the most important thing is our economy in California isn't doing that well. It's actually kind of sluggish. And the data should be a little concerning to people. I mean, for example, we have been at or near the top in unemployment, our unemployment rate, ever since the pandemic hit. And right now it's 5.4%, which doesn't sound bad, but it's actually the second highest in the country, just behind Nevada. And there's whole segments of California's economy now are really feeling the pinch. Certainly the technology industry in the Bay Area is feeling the pinch. Lots of layoffs, a lot of reconfigurations going on there. Down south, the movie TV industry is really hurting badly. It just hasn't picked up at all. It's actually kind of withering away in many respects in terms of both employment and the number of shows being shot in the Los Angeles area, because other states and other countries are kind of cleaning our clock on that subject. And finally, the third major economic activity, at least one of our most prominent ones, is agriculture. Agriculture is hurting these days. And that was even before the tariffs reached in. Agriculture is hurting because of water supply issues. The amount of land in California under cultivation is shrinking. It's shrinking in the San Joaquin Valley. It's shrinking in the Sacramento Valley for a variety of reasons, but primarily because of water supply issues. Not that the water isn't there necessarily, but the allocation to agriculture is declining. I think the other thing we have to remember about California at this moment, particularly at this moment, is California's problems were not caused by Donald Trump. Yes, maybe the tariffs might exacerbate some of the state's economic woes, but basically California's issues our existential crises, if you will, have gone on for a long time, long before Donald Trump became president, even the first time. For example, our housing shortage. It's permeable, and it affects the economy, because if employers can't hire the people they want because they can't find housing, they're not going to hire those people. They're not going to expand in California. And we're seeing evidence of that every day. Tied in very closely with that is basically the cost of living in California, which is extremely high, second only to that in Hawaii. And not only for housing, but for things like energy. Energy costs are just way out of whack with the rest of the country. That's electric power particularly. And of course, we have the homelessness problem that is by far the nation's most worst, not only in quantitative terms, so close to 200,000 people unhoused in California, but in relative terms as well, as a percentage of our population, far higher than any other state. And these are all issues that have arisen over the last, at least during this century, the last 25 years, that have been either unaddressed or addressed in such a way that they haven't been resolved. These things are ongoing problems, and I could add to that several more, such as California's having one of the lowest levels of educational achievement in federal academic achievement tests. In other words, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the real basics. We're way down there. We're down there with Mississippi and places like that, which should be, if we had a really rational political system, things like that would be like, hey, we have to declare an emergency and do something about that. But we just kind of let it go on year after year after year without being addressed. These are all, I would call them existential issues, because they really affect whether California can continue on at a high level of economic production and social mobility that have been the hallmarks of the state since it's being admitted to the Union in 1850, 175 years ago. It is really an existential thing. We have been sometimes losing population in recent years. At the very least, we're not growing very fast. That means our population is getting older. It means that the working age population is shrinking. It means that employers, despite having a high unemployment rate with over 1 million workers in California officially unemployed, not counting those who are kind of marginally unemployed, probably gets up to about double that. Despite that, many employers are finding difficulty finding employees, capable employees, people who are trained or can be trained. And though you go back to the deficiencies in our education system, these are all very serious things, and really not a single one of them has anything to do with Donald Trump. And yet, if you kind of test the atmosphere in politics in California, you would think that Donald Trump has caused all of them, that he's threatening California, and we have to fight him and all that. Well, maybe we do need to do that, but Donald Trump did not cause our fundamental problems, and whether he's president or not president is going to have absolutely no effect on that. And I think that's you have to kind of keep reminding us, because it's so convenient for the political class in California, all Democrats, overwhelmingly Democrats, of course, seem to want to just talk about Trump, 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 Trump all the time. Scarcely a day goes by that the California Attorney General doesn't file a new lawsuit against Donald Trump, for example, and it just becomes pervasive. The people who are thinking about running for governor next year seem to be competing with one another on how much they oppose Trump. Well, okay, that's fine. But what about all of these other things that are going on, They're festering problems that go on year after year after year. It didn't just happen that we have a housing shortage. It didn't just happen that we have a homelessness issue. It didn't just happen that our energy costs were high. It doesn't happen that we have such a high unemployment rate. This is stuff that's been going on for a long time. And it would be a shame, I think, if next year's campaign for governor was just over who could be the most vocal opponent of Donald Trump, rather than focusing in on these very fundamental existential issues that will determine whether California prospers as a state and its citizens enjoy what is the kind they used to call the California dream going forward. I think this is the California dream in California is definitely under siege because of our own actions and inactions. And we should insist that when people are running for governor in 2006, they start talking about that and not just how mean they're going to be to Donald Trump. I'm going to stop there. That's about 10 or 15 minutes of my vitriol. And we can start on the questions, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Certainly plenty to think about. And as we think about, what the direction is of folks on the state, I'll move into a lot of those questions here shortly and follow up on some of those remarks that you just gave. But I actually wanted to turn, before we totally dive in, put a little bit of focus on you, so we'll get a chance to maybe get to know you a little bit better. You said you never set out to be a political writer, that it just happened because the student newspaper needed a photographer. So looking back, was there a moment when this stopped being a job, started being something more, where you really started to see yourself as playing a role in illuminating so many of the issues we face as a state?
Yeah, and I started as a photographer for the student newspaper. I didn't know how to type. I still don't really know how to type. Kind of modified hunt and peck. But at any rate, I did become the editor of the high school newspaper in my junior year. And I wrote an editorial that completely irritated the administration, and they were screaming and yelling at me. And I said, this is a lot of fun. you can criticize people and watch them flop around and complain about it, but it's a lot of fun. So about a year after that, I dropped out of college. I dropped out of high school, went to work on the newspaper, and it's been fun ever since.
So you fell in love with being a rabble rouser to a certain degree.
It's just fun being kind of an insider and an outsider at the same time. Mm-hmm. You're an insider in that you know a lot of stuff that's going on. You're an outsider in that you're not part of what's going on. You're an observer of what's going on, a fly on the wall, as we used to call it. And
did you ever think of becoming an insider? Did you ever think about running for office, Dan?
Well, no. I've been asked that question many times, and I say, does an entomologist want to be a bug? Does a proctologist want to be, what a proctologist does? No, you want to study them, you want to deal with them, but you don't want to be one of them. And that's my attitude about politics. Yeah, I look at politicians as a species. It's a species, and with unique features that other species don't have. And so I kind of think of myself as an entomologist of politicians, watching the species do all the things that the species does, and that's what I do.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's well, both humorous and I imagine a common question for you. So thank you for taking it today. But all right, so in your journalistic career in the state of California, you've covered everyone from Jerry Brown the first time, Duke Majan, Wilson, Davis, Schwarzenegger, Jerry Brown again, and now Gavin Newsom. In your perspective, what's changed the most? What perhaps hasn't changed at all in the governor's office? Some reflections over that period of time and leadership from the governor's office in Sacramento.
Well, I think you have to also include the legislature in that, because the Capitol is a two-headed monster. You know, it's the legislature and the governor. So they are either in concert or in opposition or everything, but the dynamic has to deal with all of them. And what I've seen over time is a lot of superficial change in politics in the Capitol. When I started covering the Capitol in 1975, not only was Jerry Brown a very young man, he's a little bit older than I am. But the legislature, on the other hand, was basically middle-aged to elderly white men, overwhelmingly. Well, that's changed dramatically over time. Many more women, almost parity in gender. A lot of people who are not white Anglo-Saxon people. There are a lot of Latinos. There's a lot of ethnic groups now in the legislature, and that's good. I mean, because the legislature more adequately mirrors the state. But on the other hand, there's a subtle change in that when it was all white males, they had a sense of kind of camaraderie. It was like a club almost, or a fraternity or something, which was not always the best thing, but there was a certain cohesion there that has kind of gone away. And to a certain extent, the legislature has broken down into kind of tribes, as you were, defined by sometimes geography, by ideology, by ethnicity, by gender, and all these kind of tribes then have their own agendas, and there's less cohesion in the legislature and more of kind of pursuing these individual groups, which actually reflects the state. It also reflects the state as a whole, because we are a state of many tribes. And despite the dominance of Democrats, there's still a lot of tribes even within that Democratic majority. Governors, on the other hand, have had to deal with that fact of a ever-changing sort of picture in the legislature, particularly now that term limits have come along, it's even more changing. And it's become a more difficult job trying to get a program passed in the legislature that has so many different aspects, so many different factions within it. Also, the other thing I noticed is, oddly enough, as the Democrats have become more dominant in the legislature, and it is total dominance, and in the Capitol generally, it's become much more secretive. There's a lot less done in public and much more done behind the scenes now than ever was done before. I can remember when committee hearings, for example, were real hearings, and they had real discussions and real debates and so forth. Now committee hearings are just like pro forma. It's all programmed in advance, and there's no real ethic. They get up there, they give each person 2 minutes to say their speech, and then they ask people in the audience to get 60 seconds, and then they say, "Oh, just name your time, don't even talk." So there's not really any dialogue going on in committee hearings anymore. It's all now behind the scenes, a great deal of secrecy. That's particularly true of the state budget, which is now, because it no longer requires a 2/3 vote, it's all done secretly back in the back room somewhere, and then sprung upon the public, along with a whole bunch of what are called trailer bills that are densely written things that it's almost impossible to figure out what they really do, and you find out, it takes weeks, months, sometimes years to find out what's in those trailer bills. So it's a more complicated place, and a more secretive place than it was once upon a time. In terms of, I would say, to offer one positive thing. It's not as corrupt as it used to be. That's a good thing, I suppose. But in terms of actually doing the people's work, I don't think it works quite as well as it once did, because it's kind of scattered among so many different factions and so many different causes, rather than focusing on the main game, which gets back to my original remarks of what is the main game. Well, it should be housing and energy prices and education and those sorts of things. And those things seem to take a back seat to all the rather singular causes that are pursued in the legislature, rather than you don't see people with the big picture so much as we used to see.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficult thing. So that's the big changes that I've seen over the last 50 years.
In terms of like the less dialogue at the committee meetings, because that's interesting to me, is that something that you think comes from you have to have a certain level of confidence with the public eye, cameras rolling, reporters in the room, to have a free flowing dialogue about these issues? Do you think that pull back on that open dialogue in committee hearings has something to do with term limits? I mean, you started to speak to that to a certain degree, is that these folks feel the clock running, feel more politically, are a little less comfortable in those chairs than maybe they once were?
I think it has more to do with two factors. Number one, the dominance by one party. Mm-hmm. And so they can do all this stuff behind the scenes because they don't have to deal with the Republicans, who are so few in number that they have no clout. So they're being secretive because they can be secretive. They couldn't do that when there was a balance in the party balance, because you couldn't pull it out. But the other party would call you to account. The other thing is the decline in the Capitol Press Corps has been palpable. There used to be better part of 100 journalists covering the California Capitol, and most communities in the state, even some of the smaller communities, places like Ventura, Riverside, and Santa Rosa, places like that, used to have people in the Capitol watching out for their own legislators, keeping an eye on them. Those people are all gone. The Capitol Press Corps has shrunk to a shadow of its former self. CalMatters is basically probably over half the Capitol Press Corps all by itself these days.
Wow.
And even the large institutions like the Los Angeles Times have shrunk. All the TV stations from LA and San Francisco used to have people in the Capitol. No more. The shrinking Capitol Press Corps means it's easier to do things in secret. And they do it. And they can do it because they can do it. And there's no penalty to be paid for being secret, because the Democrats completely dominate the building.
That's really fascinating to hear you say that half of the press corps in Sacramento is now driven through CalMatters. Is there anything else filling the gap? Do you see other organizations emerging in this journalistic gap that's being created in the state of California and beyond?
Well, we have seen the same, in a sense, the same kind of dynamic in the press corps as we saw in the legislature. Instead of having a lot of people covering the thing in general, like newspapers used to do, what we have is a bunch of, we have journalists here who are covering very narrow subjects, like finance or tech or something like that. So they know that it's important to know what's going on in the Capitol. California, the big and powerful state, you have to keep track of what's going on. But they have a very narrow focus for that. There's very little, I would call general coverage. Even the wire services have dropped, are less than they used to be in Cal. We used to have UPI and AP. There is no more UPI. AP is cut back to, I think, about 2 people. The LA Times used to have 8 or 9 or 10, and now they're 4 or 5. Sacramento Bee used to have 12, and now they're like 4 or 5. I mean, it's really and all those local people from all these other communities have gone. They're no longer there. So if you're a legislator from Riverside, you don't have to worry about a reporter for the Riverside Press Enterprise looking over your shoulder the way they used to. Mm-hmm. So they can do it. They can be secret because of both the lack of political competition and the lack of oversight by the media.
So there's a theme emerging here, and I think it's a theme that also is kind of carried through your writing as I've followed you for many years. I think you've written often about California's habit of pursuing big ideas without fully grappling with the long-term impacts. So is there a policy decision from the last 50 years or even the last year that you think best captures California's struggle with long-term consequences, like intended or not, just policy consequences
Well,
of these
yeah,
decisions
I
that
mean,
they're
one
making?
obvious one is the bullet train. I
Mm.
mean, the legislature put a ballot measure on in 2007 that said $10 billion, actually $9.95 billion for a bullet train, and we'd be riding these trains by 2020. And it was only going to cost about $30 billion. Well, it was nowhere near reality, as we have since found. They're struggling just to run a line down in the San Joaquin Valley. The costs have got escalated like crazy. Nobody really made an effort to figure out what it would cost and what the parameters were to build this system. It was like a kind of like Field of Dreams. Oh, well, build it and people will come. Well, they can't even build it, much less people coming. It's an obvious reason, but it's not the only one. We've seen, for example, the state adopt massive information technology programs to run government, and most of them have been failures, either failing to get off the ground or not living up, because nobody really paid attention to the whole thing before lurching into the issue. And we've seen that on various levels. Most recently, we saw the legislature and Governor Newsom expand Medi-Cal coverage to all undocumented immigrants last year. It was supposed to cost about $6 billion. So far, it's costing twice that much. And now it looms as a major issue in a state budget that's leaking red ink, serious red ink, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Why? Because they do these things and they want them to happen, so they minimize the actual scope of what they're doing, or they got interested in knowing the scope, and then it comes back to bite them. It's not that much different than finances, home finances. A few years ago, the legislature got a big shot of money from the federal government due to the COVID pandemic, kind of a stimulus money. Well, they and local governments and school districts all over the state set about spending that money on things that could not be sustained once that money was gone. And that's why cities and school districts and the state itself are now facing serious budget crises. They just overextended themselves using one-time money, and now they're all having to pay the price. It's like you get a rich uncle dies, gives you $50,000. Well, you can put the $50,000 in the bank. You can put the $50,000 buy one thing, maybe a new car, or you can pretend that you're going to get $50,000 every year and spend that way. And that's what the legislature and a lot of local governments have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years. Look at Oakland.
We would all love a rich uncle, but doesn't always result in good governance or financial practices. So I wanted to touch on a few of the things you had you had touched on, some pretty big issues in your opening remarks: housing shortage, cost of living, energy costs, homelessness, all these workforce development, all these big areas for the state of California, education. I'm going to kind of pivot to one area in particular, the energy transition. So especially the push away from traditional fuels, I think it will reshape the state in significant ways, particularly regions like the East Bay with a strong industrial past and present. How do you think leaders are handling that transition? And do you think they are ready for the economic consequences in this instance?
I think it's another example of kind of wishing for something to happen like the bullet train, but not really scoping out what it would take to make it happen. And it's probably a fundamental endemic failure of government to think ahead rather than act in the moment. But certainly it's true in this case. I mean, you think about that transition you talk about is immense, just absolutely immense. There are 30 million cars on the roads of California. 30 million. You know how much money that thing to convert all of that to electric cars? Huge money. And it looks like the bloom has gone off the roads. There was an early surge in ZEVs, as they're called, zero emission vehicles. by people who could afford them.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like, okay, but what about everybody else?
Yeah.
How, it's everybody's finally seeing that this kind of the bloom come off that rose a little bit. And what is the plan, other than just passing a law saying you're not going to sell any more gasoline powered cars after 2035? What is your plan to actually make that transition in a way that won't bankrupt people who can't, who buy cars?
Yeah.
And are you going to have enough electricity to power all those cars at the same time that you're converting the electric power system of California to wind and solar? So it's not only a conversion of your present output of electrical energy, but the surge that will be required if all these electric cars hit the road when you say they're going to hit the road. And I think this has not really truly been scoped out. And it's a dangerous thing if it's mishandled. If we don't have enough charging stations, if we don't have enough electricity in the charging stations, what about the gasoline for all the leftover gasoline-powered cars if the refineries start shutting down, which they are doing? Where's that gasoline going to come? Are the refiners going to say, I'm not going to put any more money into my refinery because they want me to put me out of business?
Yeah.
Where's the plan? And I have not seen
I think you might have the idea for a T-shirt at the East Bay Leadership Council. What's the plan? Maybe something that we may need to start producing in our merch planning for the year to come. But I think there's an assumption built in to a lot of these issues that identified, that's the state's economy will thrive regardless of how we treat those fundamentals like infrastructure, education, and housing. Do you think there's a certain point where we're reaching a breaking point of that assumption for the state of California?
I think there's a certain arrogance about California that we don't have to do things like other people do because we're California. And kind of like my cat, who never pays any attention to what I want her to do. She's a kitty cat, so she's going to do whatever she wants to do, regardless. So, and it's that same kind of attitude. It's almost a kind of an immaturity about not really thinking through things like that. No, I think there is a tipping point, and we may be seeing the beginnings of that tipping point. We're seeing it in the rise of rivals in the technology business, places like Austin, Texas. And we're seeing it in big and small ways. We're seeing it. Something we discussed on a previous conversation about what's been going on in the East Bay area, like in Bishop Ranch, where it used to be corporate head. It was corporate headquarters. Now they're leaving, and that's going to have to be transferred into something else. And this is
they're making some bold moves for increasing the housing supply to help support their commercial real estate office space offerings in that region, while adding retail. I think they're diversifying in a really bold way.
But maybe they're also shedding some jobs, right? At the same time. So
yeah, and I think some fundamental questions. I mean, we could get into a whole thing that, like, what does a thriving job center look like today? Do you need?
I think the housing thing is one that drives almost everything else. Not only does it have social effects of having a population that has a very low home ownership level, second only to New York State, but that the market prices out so many people. We have an awful lot of poor people in California. Think about this. Out of a state of 40 million people, 15 million are on the Medi-Cal program for the poor. 15 million people. That's a huge population. How are they going to afford those electric cars? How are they ever going to be able to get a house if they can? How are they going to deal with the rents that seem to be rising steadily? These are very existential issues. And if you don't have affordable housing, that means that employers will not expand because their employees can't afford to live there. And it just has a mushrooming effect on all phases. And if the economy stagnates, which it kind of is in California these days, that means less money for local governments, for schools, for the state government to do things that need to be done. The economy is basic to everything, and housing is basic to the economy.
Another T-shirt idea. You're doing great work for us
yeah, and
this
so
afternoon, Dan.
it drives so many other issues. It is so important, and yet we see, yes, the state has made efforts to try to make it easier to develop housing, but so far all of these efforts have not really paid off in any kind of a big surge in housing. We're still generating about 100,000 units of housing a year in California, which is scarcely half of what the state says we need to be building. Even though our population has stagnated and growth is very low, if any, we still have a leftover housing shortage that drives up rents and house prices to some advantage, to people some advantage, including mine. I just sold one house this week, but to others, it's a barrier. And they will say, why do I stay in California where I can't afford a house? I can't even afford the rent. I'm going to go someplace else. I might make less money, but I'll be better off.
Yeah.
And if California is no longer the kind of shining place on the hill that draws draws in talented people to make the economy go, which is California's prospered through all these different. We're then going, think about this. Think about this. If you go back 100 years to 1925, the Silicon Valley of that age, where all the entrepreneurship and very capital and everything was going, was Detroit. What happened to Detroit? They took it for granted. They always assumed it would be there. And they found out that it's not always there. And if you don't pay attention to the fundamentals, if you don't pay attention and you get out of whack, you pay the price.
Yeah.
And
don't take it for granted.
We may be the new Detroit rather than, well, the new Silicon Valley is someplace else. It's in Austin, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee, or someplace else. And then what do? We then have an aging population with a declining workforce and high living costs, and people can't afford them. And we start this downward thing that we've seen in other states. We've seen that in Michigan before. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we are right at this very moment tied with Michigan for the second highest unemployment rate in the country. So Michigan isn't that far away when you think about that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right to like the focus on not taking the fundamentals for granted, making sure that we're remaining competitive, not only as regions, but as a state, I think is certainly central to our work at the East Bay Leadership Council. I'm going to go to a couple questions that we've been submitted to the group to keep them engaged from the audience. There's one question here it's going back to your kind of talk about camaraderie in the legislature. During that era that you saw more camaraderie in the legislature, did you see better outcomes? You mentioned that there was more corruption. How did that improve? How did that improve people doing the people's business? So, like some reflections on that time.
One is not exclusive to the other. You can have a productive legislature that's corrupt. We actually saw that for a long time. Back in the 40s and 50s, the legislature was notoriously corrupt. I mean, it was really corrupt. There were.
How are you defining productive in this scenario? Let's put a finer pin on that.
That's the era in which we saw all these things we now take for granted in California: highway systems, higher education, state parks. All of those water systems were all done in an era of fairly high corruption in the legislature, because corruption does not deal with big issues. Corruption only deals with small issues. Somebody getting a little piece of this or a little piece of that and getting a payoff to do this little thing. Those things are terrible and they're corrupt, but they don't affect the big issues like education and water and transportation and housing and all those things.
So are you making a case for bringing corruption back? Like what's the path forward?
I'm making a case for bringing back I'm bringing back an engaged capital that's engaged in dealing with the big issues of California. no, I don't want them to be corrupt, but I don't think it makes any particular difference whether they are or not, as long as they get this other stuff. It actually has a history that the guy who controlled everything back in that era, a guy named Artie Samish, actually wrote a book about that, how he corrupted the legislature. But as long as the people he corrupted took care of his clients, like the liquor industry, they were free to be good legislators, and they really were.
Well,
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but that was actually true. You know, you don't want corruption, but it has nothing to do with the big picture, really. It only has to do with this little stuff that people are corrupt. Corruption is petty stuff. It's a little gambling thing or a liquor thing or a something like that, but it's not the big things. And that's what the problem. If you have a legislature that's corrupt and doesn't do the big stuff, that's a real problem. But if they're corrupt and they do the big stuff, which they did back in those days, 40s, 50s, and 60s, then it's like, okay, they shouldn't have been corrupt, but by God, we got the schools, we got the universities, we got the highways, we got the water, we got this stuff from a corrupt legislature.
Speaking of water, there's also a question from the audience here about, will Sites Reservoir and the Delta Conveyance be built? If yes, when? They're cutting right to the point. What do you think about that, Dan?
Sites is almost a guarantee now to be built. It's only taken 70 years for Sites, but yes, it's getting money. The feds are putting money into it. The state's putting money into it. It will happen, and it's an important part of the water picture. The tunnels are another question. I think it's touch and go whether the tunnel will ever happen. It's entirely possible that the delta will collapse before the tunnels ever get there, because the levee systems in the tunnel in the delta are very weak, getting weaker. In fact, we have a long article about that in CalMatters right now. And I know the delta very well. I was a boater for many years and went all throughout the delta, and it's a great place. But I want to tell you, it just lives on the edge. And as we get rising ocean levels, the delta, which is a very artificial environment, it's really a swamp, naturally speaking. It's not what it is today. It's all man-made, and with a lot of levees that were built kind of haphazardly back in the 19th century. And it's very subject to rising sea levels and earthquakes and everything else. But frankly, the amount of money it would take to fix those levees in the delta are not worth it, because the land is really not that valuable to justify all the many billions of dollars it would take to fix it. So I think what will happen is that it's entirely possible that the delta will basically collapse before the tunnel ever gets bored before it. And there's a lot of opposition to that tunnel, and there's a lot of equivocation from the water agencies that would have to pay for its construction, particularly in Southern California. And so I think, yes, Sites, maybe the tunnels.
That's good. Well, no, and you've certainly, well, I could go deep on this topic as the son of a lifelong Fish and Game employee, and I spent riding around on a boat in the Delta with my dad, who worked on that levee habitat for Fish and Game for much of his career. Certainly an area of passion for me, but lots of questions from the audience, so I'll keep moving. So recently, Prop 35 passed in 2024 was supposed to boost pay for doctors treating Medi-Cal patients, but the state missed a key federal deadline in March, just a couple weeks ago, and now those funds are delayed. We don't need to get into the details of that in particular, but I'm just wondering, what does that breakdown say about how well California turns policy promises into results? Or is this an exception that proves the rule? I think I know the answer that you're going to say to this, or how can we avoid and put our state in a better position to not miss out on opportunities like this in the future?
Well, we had two major ballot measures passed. That was one of them. And the other one was Prop 36, which changed penalties for some crimes, both of which were opposed by the governor and the Democratic majority in the legislature. And I would say, to be charitable about it, they're slow rolling the implementation of both of those things. The governor still would like to have that Medi-Cal money to balance the non-Medi-Cal side of the budget, which has a serious red ink problem. And the legislator who dislike Proposition 36 are kind of, and the governor are kind of unwilling to put money in the budget to enforce it. So we'll see what happens on those two things, but they both suffer from the same thing of being something in which the people, the voters, overrode the Democratic majority in the legislature and the governorship, and they don't like being overridden. So whether either one of those things can survive is it may take some judicial action to get it going.
Interesting reflection there. I guess I'm gonna pivot slightly to, you've covered countless governors, legislators, ballot initiatives. Is there anything that stands out to you as the most effective policy maker, policy mechanism? What made it effective? And I really hope the answer isn't corruption, but what made those policymakers most effective in your view?
Engagement, not being discreet. A good example of that is Jerry Brown. During his first governorship, which lasted from 1975 to whatever it was, 8 years later, 83, I guess. He was I would say, distracted by running for president of the United States twice and the U.S. Senate once. And he didn't really focus on California issues. He got stars in his eyes from national media attention and that sort of thing. And he was just young, and young. Jerry Brown 2.0, who came back in 2011, was very engaged and very effective as a governor. He kind of straightened out the state's finances, at least for a while, and he did a big overhaul of school finance that you have to say is an accomplishment for him, although we still don't know whether it's going to work out or not over time. And he did some other thing, a big overhaul of the workers' compensation system. He actually was a very engaged and effective governor. And that's what it's engagement. Listen, here's the recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned. All the candidates, the next governor of California is almost certain to be a Democrat. Somebody. It's either going to be Kamala Harris or the lieutenant governor or Antonio Villaraigosa or something. He's going to be a Democrat. They could spend that entire campaign competing with one another of denouncing Trump, and then walk into the governor's office, and all these issues I mentioned are going to be sitting there because none of them are going to be resolved before the next governor comes in, including a state budget. We're still going to have budget deficits. Everybody in the Capitol recognized that. Deficits of the $10 to $30 billion a year indefinitely because of overspending one-time revenues a couple of years ago. They're going to walk in there and they're going to have all these issues, and none of which have anything to do with Trump. And they will have not offered anything of what they intend to do about housing and water and education and all these other things. And we're going to have another disengaged governorship. These issues need engagement. It's tough. They are very difficult issues. They're very difficult because California is a very complicated state, and there's no policy that you can think that one size fits all policy that's not going to generate opposition. You have to be engaged, and you have to work at it. And you have to be realistic about what you can accomplish and what you can't. Not overpromise, and underdeliver. That's what we need in the governorship. And if all they do is run around saying Trump, 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 we're not going to get that. They're all going to define themselves by Trump rather than how they would govern California. And probably, depending on who may be off running for president again, like Jerry Brown did twice during his
Yeah, I mean, we've got a history of that in California. It seems like you're communicating that you're concerned that California leadership can sometimes be more focused on the national stage than the state itself. That fair statement?
They're seduced by the fact that as soon as you're elected governor of California, suddenly you're a national political figure, and the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and NBC, and CBS, and CNN all rush to your door to interview and make you a big person, a big wheel politically. and you get your attention diverted into that. I've seen it happen. Even somebody who was so engaged, like Pete Wilson was engaged very much, but suddenly towards the end of his governorship, he got the idea he wants to run for president.
So I'm going to make it the obvious transition here. Who do you think will be the next governor of California?
I don't know. I don't know because
not acceptable answer.
Everyone is waiting for Kamala.
Yeah.
There's a big long story in the New York Times today. A typical New York Times story is where it has millions of unnamed sources, and it's all focused on not only whether she'll run for governor, but whether she sees that as the best, as a way of opposing Trump. I don't want somebody like that as governor. If that's really her focus, I want somebody who's going to focus on California.
I would think in the best case scenario, you might think that like, hey, she already had her run at governor or at president, right? So if you were going to focus, all right, it's time to come home. I'm done with the federal fights. Let's focus on solving. Maybe it's Jerry Brown 2.0. It's after the run president.
There's a difference between running for governor and being governor. As we found out with Gavin Newsom, he had all these things he was going to do when he was running for governor. Single-payer health care, we're going to build 3.5 million new housing units, blah, 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 blah. We're going to fix homelessness. None of them occurred. None of them occurred. They need to have their feet held to the fire over what are you going to do about California. And I fear, as I said, that the new governor's campaign is going to be all about Trump, 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 Trump. And it's so, I mean, if you say Trump, then you get on CNN. If you say, I want to fix the water system, CNN doesn't give a damn. You see, it's so seductive to be the governor of California and suddenly a national political figure that people get their heads turned. I think you can say that about Gavin Newsom. He got his head turned, certainly. He spends most of his time this day, on this kind of national image building rather than fixing California. And all these problems that he inherited from Jerry Brown are going to be there when he leaves. And they haven't been fixed. And there haven't been very effective, even attempts in many cases of fixing. Yeah, they've tried to do something about housing. Yeah, they've kind of swiped at homelessness, but the problems haven't gone away. They've gotten worse than ever. And they're going to be there when the next person becomes governor. And why we tolerate governors doing that is beyond me. Why should we let them get away with that? If you want to be governor of California, then deal with California. Don't deal with
Well, we've got some questions focused on California in the chat or in the Q&A feature. Again, if you have questions, please send that to that Q&A feature in the webinar. There's a question here, and I think you spoke to that structural deficit that we face as a state. I think you said between 10 and 30 billion dollar structural deficit. Another kind of revenue that could be more less stable than it has been in years past would be the gas tax revenues that electric cars don't pay. How will, in that scenario, do you believe there's a vision in the legislature? What do you think the right path forward to be to make sure that our infrastructure is invested in the way that it needs to be?
If you assume that the governor's decree of no more gas cars is going to become reality 10 years hence, then that issue looms large. You cannot, that gas tax revenues are already going down because cars have become more efficient and because more people are driving the ZEVs than they did before. So they're already flattening out and going down. But the needs for the highway system continue going up, and inflation and whatever. This is a number that should shock people, but it's absolutely true. Californians drive almost 1 billion with a B miles every single day. Every single day. That is tremendous wear and tear on the highways of California, and they need complete, they need constant maintenance, constant upgrading, and that's gas tax money. You got to do something different. There are several things kicking around, a mileage fee or a yearly bigger thing that you pay off each month or something. There's a lot of ways you could do it, but each one of them has drawbacks. The thing about the gas tax is it's easily collected. It's an easy tax to put on and collect. Anything you put in lieu of that is going to be more difficult, like a mileage tax. Well, how do you then gauge those miles? Do you put a little meter in everybody's car? Well, the privacy people say, no, you can't do that. You can't track where everybody goes. Is it going to be self-reporting? Will everybody be accurate about that? What would you do? There's all of them have problems, which you get away from the gas tax, but you have to do it if you're really serious about limiting gas cars. You've got to do it, but it's daunting. It's one of those things that if you're governor, you got to deal with it. You can't just kick the can down the road and let somebody else deal with it.
Yeah. Some big problems and needed some audacious solutions, no doubt.
Yeah, the next governor comes along, that's one of those serious issues you need to not just shuffle off to somebody else and kick it down the road.
Another big question that showed up in our Q&A here, what can be done to reform the Coastal Commission in this regard relative to helping desalination efforts and the water supply for California? Any thoughts on that question?
That's actually pretty simple when you think about it. The governor and the legislature would just have to pass the law to do it. If you assume that desalination is a major part of California's water picture going forward, then you have to do that. And yes, the enviros and the commission will scream and yell and jump up and down, stamp their feet and all this kind of stuff. But if it's serious, you got to do it. It's part of that governance thing. You have to deal with the priorities. In this case, water supply. And if that's the chosen way of augmenting the water supply, then you have to do whatever's necessary politically to do it, rather than just kind of kicking it down the road again. It says all these things about kick down the road, and there it goes back to the idea: is the next governor going to be serious about some of these things, like water supply, or not, as the case may be? Because the thing about this is that the issues that California faces, these existential issues, housing, water supply, education, all these things, they're long-term things. They take a long term to develop problems, and they take a long term to fix them. Politicians are here one day and gone the next, and it's very, very tempting to just kick it. And I'll give you an example of it. When Gray Davis became governor in 1999, one of his first acts was to have a white paper on water policy, which basically said, will not make any decisions for 7 years. I mean, instead of just kicking it down the road later, he kicked it down the road right off the bat. We're not going to deal with it during my governorship. In the story. And it's very tempting to do that, because yes, people will get angered, but there's no general kickback, no general backfire on doing something like that. It's hard to get opposition to something you don't do as opposed to opposition to something you are doing.
Yeah.
So by not doing something is the easiest way out on all of these things, and that is the siren song for governors. Is it's a lot more fun to be interviewed by CNN than to dig into one of these things and knock heads and try to get something done on one of these issues. And it's just human nature. It's just simply human nature.
Kind of an introspective question for you. You've been observing 5 decades, policy debates and reforms. Is there a change reform that you once believed in that you've reconsidered, that like brilliant idea from the past that now you're like, ooh, that wasn't so good? Any kind of introspection if you reflect on so many opinions that you've shared as a result of your column for the last 50 years?
Give me a little bit of a thought. I would say that something I mentioned earlier. When I first started covering the Capitol, I was all hot to trot about undercovering corruption. Wrote a lot of stuff about corruption and all this stuff. But I came to realize that as kind of nasty that sort of stuff is, it really doesn't have any effect on the bigger game of governing California. It's just it's petty stuff. It really is petty stuff. It's nickel and dime stuff, relatively speaking, and we shouldn't tolerate it. In fact, we have actually a corruption problem. It's not so much in the legislature. We have a lot of corruption among the small cities in Los Angeles County. That's an endemic problem. I mean, really bad. But on the other hand, it doesn't really mean that much in the long run. The more important thing is to focus on these existential issues and try to do something about it. Because if you don't do it, California is going to fail someday.
Yeah.
We're going to really fail. We're going to be Detroit if we don't do this.
So what makes you most hopeful about California's future? Is there anything that's like the light on the hill? Obviously, there's lots of things you're concerned about. Anything that makes you believe that California's future will be brighter than our past?
I think I'm hopeful about California's becoming more ethnically diverse, which it, of course, has done. We still are a place that people want to come to for certain kinds of things, even though the housing costs a hell of a lot of money and all this stuff. If you are an innovating person, if you're from over in Taiwan or you're in India or anywhere else, in Ukraine or someplace, and you really want an opportunity to make your mark, California is still that place to come to. And that's the hopeful part, that the people will keep coming. And I think in regard to that, we need to really, as a state, really press Washington to do something about the immigration situation. We have a couple of million undocumented immigrants in California. We all know some of them. They're wonderful people mostly. They don't really cause any problems. All they want to do is make a better life for themselves and their families. All the reasons that people have always come to California. And we need to find some way of bringing them out of the shadows, and because they do the work that we need done, whether it's in the fields, in the lawns, in the construction, wherever it is. And by doing that, they then empower their children to get ahead, get into college, have better lives for themselves. It's the same old California dream, really. They're pursuing the California dream when other people have almost given up on it. And we need to do something about bringing them out of the shadows and making them real citizens. Yes, it's different. It's a difficult thing that they did come in here without paper, without illegally, but
an ethos of being a welcoming state could be to our advantage.
Good citizens, really. Yeah. They're not citizens, but they're good citizens, and we need to do something about that.
So another kind of introspective one. If CalMatters came to you tomorrow and said you can write one more column, Dan, one more column. How long would that column be? And what theme do you think you want to leave readers with, and that like final deliverance message that you would bring in your column?
It's the message that I've been doing ad nauseum here. Engagement. Keep your eye on the ball. Do the things that need to be done. Take care of the basics. When we took care of the basics, when we built the highways, we built the university systems, we had all this stuff, the water system. That's all you had to do. The rest of it took care of themselves. Once you had this atmosphere of good public services and that sort of thing, then people came in and said, yeah, now we can get rich. and we do all these things. That's where you got the investment, big Silicon Valley and other things. That's what you've got to do. You know, instead of all this divergent stuff, this minor stuff, keep your eye on the ball. I mean, the lesson of history is huge. When you do the basics, you have good highways, you have good universities, you got good schools, you got things, a good water system, reliable water system, and you allow people to build housing, good things happen. Why do we want to get away from that? It's a proven thing. And yet we're neglecting all of these basic things that made that happen in the first place. And we're assuming we don't need to do it anymore. Well, yeah, we do. Why aren't we doing it? And that's what I would write. Get your eye on the ball. Don't go the way of Detroit.
Well, I hope they don't ask you to do that. And if you do ever decide you want to run for office, the East Bay Leadership Council has a Build the Bench candidate training program that can help you learn how to do that. But
I'm too old and ornery to be a politician.
Well, we have a tradition in kind of closing out these events, a quick lightning round, the hardest hitting questions that you'll find throughout the day. Just one word answers here. That's all we've got.
Okay.
Bagels or donuts, Dan?
Bagels.
Bagels. Okay, that's the correct answer.
My wife was Jewish and my grandsons are Jewish.
Excuse me. One word answer. That's all we've got. That's all I can give you here. Coffee or tea?
Tea. I never drink coffee.
Tea. Okay, no coffee. Interesting factoid. Notepad or laptop?
Notepad.
Nope. Notepad. Okay. And then I think you answered this earlier, but Jerry Brown, term 1 or 2?
Oh, number 2.
Number 2 all the way. And then
spoiled brat becomes an adult, you know.
and then the most important question: East Bay or Sacramento? Choose carefully. There, Dan. East Bay or Sacramento? What's your choice?
Well, Sacramento, because I write about politics.
Well, well, you did pretty well on that one. That one was incorrect, but generally a good run through the lightning round. Thank you.
I can't afford the East Bay.
Happy to have you. Come on out.
I can't afford a house in Sacramento. I can't afford one in Walnut Creek.
We're working hard to increase the housing supply and make it a more affordable and welcoming community. I hope that you're welcome anytime. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of our series this year.
Sure, anytime.
Really appreciate your insights. And thank you everybody who tuned in. If Dan's column and CalMatters aren't already a part of your regular reading routine, you should change that. If you're not donating to CalMatters, I hope you change that. It's well worth your attention and investment. And if you're not yet, if your employer is not yet a member of the East Bay Leadership Council, I hope you'll change that too. We want to get you involved. Thank you for joining the webinar. Take care, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks again, Dan.
Bye-bye.